Welcome everybody to our December Ordinary Council meeting. I would just like to read out, before we begin, that East Gippsland Shire live streams and records, publishes its meetings via webcasting to enhance the accessibility of its meetings to the broader East Gippsland community. These recordings are also archived and available for viewing by the public or used for publicity or information purposes. At the appropriate times during the meeting, any members of the gallery who are addressing Council will have their image, comments or submissions recorded. No other person has the right to record Council meetings unless approval has been granted by the Chair. Please ensure that mobile phones and other electronic devices are turned off or in silent mode for the duration of the meeting. Councillors, I would like to remind you to make sure that you use your microphones when you are addressing the gallery. Members of the public wishing to speak, we will ensure that the microphone is turned on for you. So, beginning with would like to recognise the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Gunai Kurnai people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present and emerging. So we'll begin with 1.2 now, which is if there are any apologies, Mr. CEO.
There are no apologies, Mr. Mayor.
All right, that moves us to a declaration of conflicts of interest.
Mr. Mayor, I have 3 conflicts of interest that have been I've been made aware of. Yourself at item 5.3.1, Councillor Peltz at 5.2.1, and myself at 7.10.
Thank you, Mr. CEO. Could we have a mover for confirmation of the minutes and a seconder? Councillor Rotino, Councillor Roberts. All those in favour? Passed unanimously. Next meeting will be on Tuesday, the 4th of February 2020, held at the Corporate Centre, commencing at 6 p.m. Do we have any requests for leave of absence?
No, we do not, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. So, request to speak about your community project?
There are no requests to speak, Mr. Mayor, and there are no public questions either tonight.
Thank you. So, a record of assemblies of councillors. So we have a mover in Councillor Peltz and a seconder in Counselor Ellis. All those in favour? Passed unanimously. Right. Yeah. We have 4 petitions at 1.1 or 1.10.
There are no petitions being considered or received tonight, Mr. Mayor.
All right, that moves us to 2.1, notices of motion and or rescission. For the first one, notice of motion number 5/2019, cessation of the provision of alcohol for councillors following East Gippsland Shire Council briefings and or meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to move that, and if I get a seconder, I'll explain some of the rationale behind it.
Okay, there's moved by Councillor Rotino and seconded by Councillor Reeves. You may wish to now speak to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm expecting this will be quite a straightforward issue. In June this year, the Victoria Auditor General's Office VAGO released a report to the Victorian Parliament titled around fraud and corruption control local government. This report, whilst focusing on fraud and corruption, highlighted the fact that in local government there still seems to be a culture of entitlement for provision of alcohol with meals and after meetings. The context of the VAGO audit, the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, IBAC, has repeatedly highlighted the need for agencies to develop a culture of integrity. The provision of alcohol is not acceptable in the modern workplace, and as such, we as councillors need to show leadership and remove alcohol from our workplace. Our workplace responsibilities under the OH&S Act would also support not providing alcohol with evening meals. There is a duty of care by our organisation to ensure all our councillors get home safely. In fact, several of our councillors travel long distances on country roads to attend meetings. Furthermore, we need to show strong regional leadership. In November, we held the second walk to change the story to help raise awareness to end violence against women. East Gippsland Shire statistical information indicates that most of these incidents against women involve the consumption of alcohol. In summary, there's an expectation from our regulators, but more importantly from our community, that the provision of alcohol with councillors' meals is no longer acceptable. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Councillor Tino, thank you for tabling that notice of motion. I think that times have moved on. I think that there's no doubt that everybody here enjoys a glass of wine or a fine ale in responsible amounts, but I think that's what we do at home, and that's what we do from our own purse and not the public purse these days. I think that's consistent with most public entities these days, and I commend the motion to other councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. Do we have any speakers against the motion? Councillor Buckley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The moderate consumption of alcohol with meals has been an enjoyed tradition since biblical times, and I don't think this should be denied responsible people like us. And referring to paragraph 3, in fact, we need to show strong regional leadership. In November, we held a second walk to change the story to help raise awareness and end violence against women. East Gippsland Shire statistical information indicates that most of these incidents against women involve the consumption of alcohol. Well, surely we're not like that, are we, Councillor Bettino? I think that's a fairly offensive statement to put in your motion, and I'm afraid I can't accept it. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Yes, you have your right to reply, Councillor Rotino. Sorry, more to speak against? Sorry. Yeah. So do we have any more speakers for? Okay. Councillor Ellis, you wish to speak against?
No, I'm just trying to clarify. Council's had a reasonable discussion in relation to this matter, and we appreciate Councillor Rotino's struggle with the issue of alcohol and in our community. I want to make that clear. And I'm just wondering, would this concept expand further into other council-managed properties such as the Forge Theatre, football grounds, public halls, those other areas that come under our ambient, or is it just aimed for this chamber?
I think now you have your right to reply, Councillor Rotino. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. If anyone else is speaking for, I have to speak against.
You're still speaking against. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to, I'll be abstaining from voting on this, and I guess my area is in the reserve of having to have less compliance. I think this is a no-brainer. I support it either way, but I actually believe it's just another regulation, and I think it should be really up to the Mayor and the Executive Officer as to whether alcohol should be supplied for particular events. And I think, you know, the bottom line for me is it's just another rule and regulation that is incumbent on us, and that I actually think, you know, I'm not really prepared to support either way, so I'll be abstaining.
Thank you, Councillor Peltz. Councillor O'Connell.
I'd like to speak in support of Councillor Rotino's motion and just concur with Councillor Reeves and Rotino's comments in relation to showing strong leadership. It is well known that alcoholism is a major issue in East Gippsland, and the statistics for the violence against women speaks for itself. So I think as councillors, we are leaders of the community and we should be setting a good example. So I commend this notice of motion to the rest of you.
You wish to reply? You wish to reply? No other speakers now. I think we've gone round.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I certainly don't have an issue with alcohol. I enjoy red wine, and my culture has enjoyed red wine for a long time, so I certainly don't have an issue with alcohol. This is pretty straightforward. We can still enjoy a drink after our council meetings, but we're paying it for ourselves, and the community's not paying for it. It's just a straightforward thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rotino. So at this stage, I think we should put this to the vote. So all those in favour of the motion? Those against?
Oh, I beg your pardon? No, I didn't. I was abstaining, sorry. I meant to abstain. I didn't mean to...
You didn't vote? So you abstained? Okay, for the benefit of the minutes, the motion has passed. It's carried. 2 against and 2 abstaining, which was Councillor Ellis and Councillor Peltz, who have abstained, and Councillor Roberts and Councillor Buckley have voted against. Thank you, councillors. So next we have 2.2, which also a notice of motion number 6, 2019, inclusion of the East Gippsland Shire Council Chief Executive Officer on the Economic Development Advisory Board. And
thanks, Mayor White, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen and councillors. I'm going to get this cracking along. So my notice of motion takes 3 points. Point 1, that the Economic Development Advisory Board be renamed the Economic Development Advisory Committee, a subtle but important change. The terms of reference be amended to reflect the CEO and or their delegate as a non-voting member of the Economic Development Advisory Board. And point 3, the terms of reference be amended to allow the Mayor to attend and actively participate and or be a member of the Economic Development Advisory Board if they wish. So my discussion and rationale references the terms of reference for the Advisory Board, but I point out that councillors, at our November 2019 meeting, pardon me, Council probably unwittingly moved a motion to remove the Mayor from the Economic Development Advisory Board, and somehow the CEO seemed to be removed as well, almost as collateral damage, sort of scooped up in the same motion. And it seems to me extraordinary that the CEO and the Mayor are not able to attend the committee, given the crucial positions they hold. And rereading the notice of motion, it did actually exclude those 2 important people. So the Mayor holds symbolically the hopes and aspirations of the community, and the CEO holds the practical and transactional knowledge to implement those hopes and aspirations, councillors. The CEO is the conduit for the board to the operation of the Shire. The CEO is important to enable the committee to achieve its role as per the terms of reference, and this includes interpretation of those items listed in point 7 above, which are to provide opportunities to give feedback into strategies, policies and forums as appropriate, and bring to the attention of other members of the committee and council officers relevant strategies, policies and documents. And the person who's the conduit through to that is the CEO. To prevent the CEO from participating on the board stymies this ability to move quickly and decisively and provide timely and effective advice to council for it to make decisions for the benefit of the community. I urge councillors to support this in ensuring the CEO is on this board for these and many other reasons. Thanks, councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. Unfortunately, as I was still finishing my comments, you started your discussion, and we don't have a seconder. So Councillor Rotino has seconded. So would we have any? I know why you got a bit of haste, because we have a very big agenda. So, but we will still have to follow procedure. And would anyone else like to speak for the motion?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to concur with the comments made by Councillor Reeves. Unfortunately, I did miss the Orbost meeting, otherwise I would have been prosecuting a very similar argument around the CEO being really stopped from attending any meeting. Like, it's just silly that we actually put that into a motion, but anyhow, it's happened, and I think this notice of motion actually deals with the issue that was raised at the Orbost meeting, which I think was a good issue to raise, the separation of duties, and I think this notice of motion now addresses that in a much better way. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rotino. Do we have speakers against? Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is probably the most misleading motion that's been before this council for a good time. The CEO, to make it very clear, a couple of quick points. It's not precluded from attending the meetings, and he is well aware of that fact. I don't understand where this motion has actually come from, in fact. The chair of the board, and the advisory board, can invite the CEO to any of the meetings conducted by that board at any time. The CEO is not precluded from the proceedings of that particular board. He, under the amendment that was presented to the council at the last meeting, his delegate, which in practice would be one of his general managers, and he's seated at this table now, would be representing him and council officers at that meeting. So they would report back. If they are unable to do so, then that shows a paucity in selection of our executive team, and council has a managerial problem. I don't believe that to be the case, of course, but that's the reality. In terms of the mayor, there's no preclusion whatsoever from the mayor. As explained at the Orbost meeting, it was the term mayor that was removed. Should the mayor wish to nominate a person in the position of mayor, wish to nominate to be represented on that particular board, they can do so. It was to free up the possibility of perhaps an inappropriate or uninterested person being involved in the economic development subjects of our shire. Three, and finally, this is an advisory board, and it is important that the head of the executive of the council, the chief executive officer, maintain an impartial and clear position here, that there can be no suggestion by anyone, whether it be at this chamber's table or outside, of impropriety in any form or biasness to any particular issue. We need the CEO to provide impartial and clear advice to council at all times. I say to you that the amendments that were put before and adopted by council after good debate last month still stand, and that this is but a mischievous motion put forward, and as I say, I just don't understand where it's actually come from. I appreciate that Councillor Reeves has put it forward to the table, but I just don't understand this at all. The mayor can be a member. There is a free flow of information that can come from this particular committee. And finally, we support, as I stated in the previous motion, the activities of this particular board. So, councillors, please consider what I've put to you and vote down this particular motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ellis. Do we have any more speakers against? Four, sorry, here we go. Any more speakers for? Okay, I'll ask if we have a speaker against. Councillor Peltz.
I look at this motion and I feel what's being asked is actually what is achieved from the previous motion adopted at the November meeting. The only difference being dot point 1, which is the change of the name to an advisory committee, which I fully support, and I think it's probably the best purpose moving forward. I do believe that the Economic Development Advisory Committee is more appropriate than a board position, as is our Audit Advisory Committee and also our Disability Advisory Committee, and all of these should be considered and structured in a similar manner. So for me, there's only one dot point there, but the other things that are listed I feel have been covered in the previous one, so I'll be voting against this recommendation. Thank you.
Councillor Reeves, would you like a right of reply?
Well, councillors, I've been accused of mischief and I've been accused of misleading, but it's the most misleading and mischievous motion was that put to the council last meeting, and let me quote it. So the motion that was put up removes the Chief Executive Officer from nominated membership of the East Gippsland Shire's Economic Development Advisory Board, as referenced at 2.3.4 of the adopted terms of reference, and modifies the terms of reference to indicate that a delegate of the CEO attends the meetings but is not a member. Number 2, removes the Mayor from the East Gippsland Shire Council from nominated membership of the East Gippsland Shire Council's Economic Development Advisory Board as the Council's joint representative, and in turn nominates a councillor to that role. Removes the Mayor. Mayor can't go. CEO can't go. It's absolutely in black and white. There's nothing mischief about what I'm doing, Councillor Ellis. I know that your intention was to separate, concern over separation of duties. That having the Mayor and the CEO as non-voting members does that. Absolutely. But that particular notice of motion that we're trying to rectify and redress is neither mischievous nor is it misleading. It's actually in the best interests of our community, as a united community. The Economic Development Advisory Committee, as it should be known, should be able to have the Mayor at that table who is representing the dreams, the hopes, the aspirations. That's why the Mayor is there. You voted for that Mayor, and that motion actually removes the Mayor from being at that table. And the CEO is absolutely critical, councillors, to be there to provide, as per dot point 7 in the terms of reference, that information immediately. Councillors, you need to vote that old motion down and this new motion up. It's absolutely critical.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. So I guess we put this to the vote. All those in favour?
Oh, yes. He was having a question of clarification.
It's too late.
It's too late. No, sorry, we've gone to the vote. The questions would have been earlier. So, okay, those against? Okay. The motion is passed, 5-4. Those against, Councillor Buckley, Councillor Ellis, Councillor Roberts and Councillor Peltz. Is this... So that moves us on to deferred business. Mr CEO.
There is none, Mr Mayor.
All right, then we'll go to councillor reports.
Mr Mayor, I would like to move that we bring forward items 5.3 for consideration while the gallery is in attendance.
Just before we do that, we do need to do our councillor reports. All right, I'll run with that because in the interests of a large gallery in attendance and a very, very large agenda here, we would we're looking to move things along to suit those in the gallery, so I would accept that request, Councillor Roberts, and seconded by Councillor Peltz, that we move our 5.3. So we move 5.3 forward and address those issues, and then we'll return to the normal schedule at the finish. Thank you. So we need to vote. So we just vote on this issue now. Those for moving the agenda around, all those in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous. Now, unfortunately, I need to ask our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Buckley, to take the chair, because the very first item is the item that I have a conflict, so I will remove myself from the chamber. Thank you.
Oh, I've got it here anyway, look.
That's 5.3.1. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, I haven't had a go at this for quite some time, so we'll see how we go. 5.3.1, planning application 250/2019P, dwelling extension at 275 Hardies Road, Meetung. This is authorised by Martin Ireland, Senior Land Use Planner, and endorsed by Stuart McConnell, General Manager, Place and Community. And the document number, you don't have to worry about that. And in attendance is Aaron Hollow. So could you, Mr Hollow, please continue with this application?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, or Mr Deputy Mayor. Mr Deputy Mayor, this report brings an application to Council for a decision. Council officers are of the view that a notice of decision to grant a permit should issue. This application seeks a one-bedroom extension to an existing dwelling on a property of 27.6 hectares located within the farming zone on the outskirts of the Meetung Township. Councillors, you will recall that this application was subject to a planning consultation meeting, and councillors, there were a number of concerns raised at that consultation meeting about the extension being used as part of an Airbnb or a short-term accommodation type of use. Councillors, I can say that the Planning Department has spent considerable time working through whether there would be such a use and whether such a use is defined in the planning scheme, and there is not. This is simply a dwelling extension. It is not a self-contained unit within the greater structure of the dwelling. It is just a bedroom extension. Councillors, it needs a permit because it's located with a significant landscape overlay. We believe it's built consistent with the character of the dwelling in the area. And it also needs a permit because it's building some works to a Section 2 use within the farming zone. We recommend a notice of decision to grant a permit subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr Hollow. What do we do now?
So ask if there's any questions or discussion, and then or it can be put to the...
Thank you, councillors. Is there any questions or discussions on this matter?
I'll be happy to move the recommendation.
Thank you.
Questions, Mr Mayor, Deputy Mayor. I have a question for Mr Hollow, Mr Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Ellis. Go ahead.
Can you just clarify, is this a private residential property or is this a commercial accommodation business property?
We are led to believe that it's a private residential accommodation property.
We need a second now.
You believe it to be. I've seen, it's been brought to my attention on social media, it's advertised on Booking.com and other properties, accommodation sites as an accommodation property in the higher level for this region. Would that reality change the application in any manner?
No, it doesn't, Councillor. It's a dwelling. I don't suggest to you that on occasions it isn't booked out for some short-term accommodation at times, but its primary purpose is a dwelling.
Councillor Peltz, you had a question?
No, I'm happy to move it.
Oh, you're happy to move it. Okay, that's moved by Councillor Peltz, and could we have a seconder, please? Councillor Attino. It's seconded by Councillor Attino. Is there any more discussions on this? No, we'll just put it to the vote.
Speakers for?
Speakers for? Yeah. Speakers for? We've got speakers for this motion.
I'm happy to speak to the motion. I think this was a contested issue previously. I think the applicant has gone back and addressed his concerns and made his original plans work for him, and I think the officers are quite right in making this a granted permit. I think the recommendation is correct moving forward, and I think there's opportunity for more of this kind of thing to happen in our region. There's a need for it. We go and stay in them in other areas. I don't see why we wouldn't have them in East Gippsland. So I'm happy to move the recommendation as suggested by the officers. Thank you.
Is there any further speakers in favour? No. Any speakers against? Councillor Ellis, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. I would like to state that I'm against this particular application because it's misleading. If it was just a simple home, I would be most comfortable with it. This is a commercial enterprise that's right in our face of council and in the public's face. The application, I feel, is inconsistent with the planning policy framework, specifically clause 15/01/6S. It's also inconsistent with the local planning policy framework, specifically clauses 21/042 and 21/12(2). This is information that I've been able to gain with other councillors today and is shared with all councillors at this table. The information before council is, as I state, misleading, and for that reason I cannot support this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ellis. Have we got any more speakers? No? Looks as if the coast is clear, so I'll put this to the vote. All those in favour of the recommendation? Say aye. What about me? My turn's yet to come, thank you. And that's 1, 2, 3, 5. Okay, against? All those against? 3. Okay, now what's self-explanatory? So the recommendation is passed.
It is carried, yep.
Yeah. So congratulations, Mr Deacon, on your success today. So there we go. I'll vacate. I'll ask the Mayor to return. I hope you haven't been in the members' bar. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Buckley, and I was, but they've already put the lock on the door.
So we have a request to speak on this, John.
Okay. So this is... So our next item is 5.3.2. This is a planning permit application 185/2019/P It's an application for a two-lot subdivision at 100 Racecourse Road, and I believe we have somebody who wishes to speak on behalf of the applicant.
Evening, Mr. Mayor. Michael
Evening to you, Michael. Welcome. And just in the interests of the way we need to keep the meeting going tonight, just a reminder to those who wish to speak that we have a 5-minute time limit for the applicants and 3 minutes for anyone else who wishes to speak.
Pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the opportunity to speak, and I'd also like to acknowledge for those who are able to attend a councillor inspection of the subject land on the 8th of October earlier this year, that we're not necessarily talking about, which if you read the officer's report, a remote rural property where we're using, I note, what's meant to be, by officer's words, a rarely intended to be used clause of the planning scheme to excise a dwelling from a rural property. It doesn't say that at all. That's a very subjective interpretation which, for the purposes of writing a refusal, is able to be used, but it doesn't weight the provision. We are able to make the application. The application's been fairly made. The application to develop a smaller allotment on this particular case has been founded on what part of this property is not required for agricultural purposes, and which can be obviously best utilised as a rural residential allotment within walking distance of basically the centre of town. You know, walk to Monagle College, any parts of the town are within reasonable proximity to this project site. It's over the road from an area where we already have lots ranging in areas from 7,000 or 8,000 square metres in a rural living zone, Schedule 1. The long-awaited rural land use study, which I think previously this council in the middle of this year declared was an urgent document required by this council to give direction and guidance, still languishes. I'm glad I'm not hanging by my thumbs waiting for that, but we'll find it in the fullness of time. It's interesting, one of the guiding documents that we've been told we have to hold fast to is the Bairnsdale Growth Strategy Plan, which is 10 years old. In this very chamber, the Paynesville Marine Precinct strategy was 10 years old, and you formally declared it an obsolete and out-of-date document. I think we're in desperate need of guidance from some of these strategic documents to go forward. I've had a client who has bought a property which is significantly dissected with some interesting gullies which lead into the McLeod's Morass water system and Cobblers Creek. In his time, he's completely repaired the site from being blackberry infested, and as the various councillors who inspected it noted, our proposed subdivision basically subdivides out a driveway to a house sitting on a hilltop, and provides probably a very fine example of renewal in a precinct which is first class. I would have thought it was one of the better rural homes, not necessarily lavishly built, but certainly respectfully built in a rural theme. The ownership of my client, he purchased a 30-hectare property, which was the minimum lot size in the historic times when Racecourse Road was the boundary between the town of Bairnsdale and the Shire of Bairnsdale. So that was the smallest lot size you could get on the precinct. He has gone through aggregation, which your farming zone would call for. He's aggregated up to 46 hectares by buying land adjoining his property. He's minimised, as the planning scheme would call, the amount of land to be provided with the gully, with the house. He's environmentally improved the property with the renewal. He most certainly is welcoming, should council see fit in granting a permit, to accept a waterways management plan, which would not only see the gully that he has cleaned up improved, but also there's a major gully going east-west through the property, which he's more than happy to have an environmental and waterway management plan that might be one of the signature plans that starts the whole precinct planning. And finally, the site itself My client is well connected with the recent Gippsland Agricultural Group, who are looking to find nearby properties within the town margins where in fact you might find some pilot sites able to be developed. So you don't need 1,000 hectares to perform a rural function. We are available to undertake that. We are also eagerly waiting the Bairnsdale closer town areas where we can see the rural land use study give some definition about the margin. The margin isn't meant to be a black line where you walk into quicksand and nothing happens. It's happening by virtue of its desire as a good place to live. And I think we talk about good community and strong community. We're seeing some of the better development happening in the rural residential precincts at the moment, and I think this is one opportunity where you can actually congratulate someone for undertaking that effort. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Sadler. Councillors would like to ask any questions. And Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This question's to the proponent. Do you believe that the applicant would be in support of, if there was to be an alternate motion that was considered tonight, do you believe that the applicant would be, do you believe that the applicant would be accepting of applying a Section 173 agreement to the excise land to prevent an additional dwelling being built?
I see that we've moved past that, what I'd call a draconian, that was previously use of 173 agreements to impose an unnecessary restriction. The planning scheme enables an application to be made to excise an existing dwelling. It doesn't go, and the price you pay will be no additional dwellings. I think it's not unreasonable if it was a much larger piece of land, so it was multiples of 40 hectares, the council might say, righto, the deal you're going to have to negotiate or work with council about is we don't want to see, if you're excising a dwelling and it's not fragmenting rural land or taking unnecessarily land out of production, that you would be allowed to further subdivide that land in accordance with the schedule lot size. Whereas, I'll give you an example, if it was 125 hectares, you're not allowed to take out a 5 hectare lot and think that you would then have the opportunity to then come back and do a 3 lot subdivision on the balance at 40 hectares, which is a schedule lot size. Because then you're getting you're getting the potential of multiple dwellings. But I think one extra in this precinct brings the average density of dwellings to 1 lot for every 23 hectares, which if you cast a net along Racecourse Road, the density of dwellings there would be one dwelling in something like 3 or 4 hectares if you looked at all the properties along Racecourse Road, because you've got a heap of them on the north side beside the railway line, and you've got some larger lots, and then as you get close to the Forge Creek Road, you've then got another amount of intensification which has happened over the journey over the last 25 or 30 years.
You have another question?
So that's a no.
Yes, but it needed to be embellished, because no is... We never take no, Councillor Roberts. We always need to add a bit of sauce on it.
Councillor Peltz, you want to ask a question?
Yes, if I may, Mr. Sadler. May I ask, with the intention of the proposal of this 2-lot subdivision, was there any discussion about changing the smaller lot to please with the rural living zone that's actually over the road to start that section going on the southern side? I'm not sure that sort of runs hand in glove, but the lot size that we're proposing has been done in 2 ways. One is to absolutely minimise the amount of land being taken out, and we take the responsibility of the gully, which has been, unfortunately, council don't have the benefit of seeing it before, but my client Ben Frew has really done a lot of work to tidy it up. But it's not out of keeping with what's over the road, as I say, because over the road is an average lot size of 1 lot for each 2 hectares, and at the railway crossing end, there's lots there that are basically sewered and at 6,000 to 8,000 square metres, all with dwellings, which has been a subject of previous subdivisions. So they're an average lot size of 1 lot for 2 hectares. I did have a discussion with your client, and he was proposing to me, and I did say that I wouldn't think that you would mislead him into a direction that wouldn't be, capable of being achieved. And, it's not good business practice, and I believe that you wouldn't have done that, and he said the same. And, you're a respectable man with a great business in the community that wants to make sure everything works. So he did say to me, was there possible that you could propose a dwelling excision? Is that
Excision?
Excision, sorry. Excision, whatever it is, to excise it. So could you explain further in that area for us so that we can take that into relevance too in this case, please?
Well, I'm not sure it's anything abnormal with any rural property. There's certainly been over the last 3 to 5 years within council a lot more discretion and rigour being placed to when it's appropriate to excise a dwelling. Previously, under different planning horizons, before there was perhaps as much emphasis put on loss of agricultural land, that if you had a dwelling on a property, you could basically make application. The planning scheme permit it, and we know there's no presumption of yes, just because you make the application you're going to be granted a permit. But the excision is, if it's not required for the ongoing pursuit of agriculture on the land, you're able to make an application to excise that dwelling onto and I think we all look at it as a minimalist amount of land that doesn't have a detrimental effect on the ongoing or potentially future rural pursuits that can happen. So it's not to prejudice the farming activities, and I think in other areas excisions have always been treated very guardedly if they're in a remote rural location where you have the local bank clerk decide he wants to move into an area right next to someone's cattle yards, and next minute you've got the right to farm issues, which is another key thing. We're a rural municipality. We don't want the wrong people living in the wrong street if they're going to be there just complaining the whole time. Thank you.
Councillor Ellis.
Thanks, Mr Sadler. First, I'd like to acknowledge the work that your client has done on that property, and the natural barriers and the topography of the property lends itself to your argument. I have two questions. One is, do you see this sort of application continuing by other applicants all the way through to the Princes Highway at Mary Street because of the arguments being put before council this evening?
In fact, I've had a meeting this afternoon with one of those and they said, what are my opportunities? And I said, none. Basically because you have the impact of, I think there's a point where the Red Gum Plains commence, and I would have thought once the highway frontage hits Mary Lane, the unconstructed Mary Lane, I think we speak about natural boundaries. I think that's a natural boundary. And also brings into not necessarily conflict, but into strict review how many vehicles should be spilling out onto the highway from very minor intersections where our Racecourse Road is a reasonably major intersection and a natural point to come onto the highway. And I just don't think there's a potential to do, because of the fragmentation that's already occurred, as we head from literally the Princess Highway, Bingwarden Road through to the airport. I think we've sliced and diced that within an inch of its life, that section through there. Yeah, so I don't think there's much potential. And you've got the very broken landform that I spoke about, that part of it starts to run into the Frew property. The broken landform of running into the headwaters of Cobblers Creek, it's heavily dissected, and I think it'd be better off as almost a land care project than seeing, it doesn't need houses, it needs re-veg and gully protection, not unlike, say, the Knob Reserve at Stratford, where there's massive planting and fencing both sides of gullies and that sort of stuff. But that's a visionary comment of mine.
Okay, my second question is to you as the most experienced planner, and that is, what's the value of a growth strategy? I just recall that you were part of the consultation process in the creation of the Bensdale Growth Strategy, along with a couple of other councillors here at this table in years past. And one has to look to the future, and a 10-year document probably is in need, and I accept that, of review, but where do you draw the line in allowing alternative developments contrary to your strategy? Because you should be able to provide planned and sensible development as part of your strategy. Is it okay, in a sense, to breach those sort of ambitions of a strategy such as what we all put together?
I'm not sure this is a forum for a sermon from the Mount, but I just think the last 10 years in planning have been the most dynamic that we've ever experienced in East Gippsland. We've seen a take-up of rural residential land almost at the exclusion of infill in our townships. If we went north of Bairnsdale, there are more houses going up on Clifton West Road than there would be in the whole of the rest of the Shire almost at the rate of knots. People are voting with their feet that they want that rural residential lifestyle, and we're running out of where that might be at the moment. So Bairnsdale growth strategy maybe needs to be killed off as a term, but we've got to get grander than old Bairnsdale, limited by the old town boundaries. We've got to move into, the Bairnsdale Painesville corridor. Is that a growth strategy? What are we hanging on to that for? We drive from one town to another, and yet Painesville's growing towards Bairnsdale, but Bairnsdale's not allowed to grow towards Painesville, and that's what I see in this precinct, that we should be using the natural constraints, and that is Cobblers Creek, McLeod's Morass, and everyone wants to live on the margins. We want a cliff-top view, and I see that we've got to protect our major landfill, and then everything moving back from that, I think, should be an open for review landscape, save and except we do have the red gum plains, and they're non-negotiable. I think there's a point when we get head towards the airport that's just not possible. But I think everywhere else around Bairnsdale should be totally open. And I understand from the land use study is we should be getting a guiding document that says this land is absolutely needed for agriculture, both dry land and alternative farming, and everything else should be open for review. And I won't go into the Golden Triangle Saddler version of Lakes Entrance, Bruthen, Bairnsdale, and everything in the middle, give it up.
Oh, it's one of my favourite topics, though. But the thing is, okay, so you do support the concept of a strategy, though, to provide good guidance, because that's the underlying theme, yeah? Yeah,
but what you told your 6-year-old kid, you don't tell your 16-year-old kid, and I'm just saying we've matured past that with a rate of development. The way we're doing life now isn't what we did. That 10-year-old document adopted 10 years ago was a document that would have been started to work on 14 or 15 years ago. None of us are thinking that way now. Thank you, Dick.
Councillor Peltz.
Sorry, I've had another thought. Sorry. And I do apologise. We, as councillors, did request that the Bairnsdale growth strategy would be reviewed, and the officers at the time did promise us it would be done by December, and unfortunately they've not been able to make the deadline, so we're looking at that being addressed in the new year. So I do apologise, and I think the community should know that too, that it is something that's in our space, and it is something that
just a correction, Mr Mayor, I think that was the rural land use strategy.
The rural land, I think both anyway. But I do agree with Mr Stadler on the grounds that they should be reviewed on a regular basis, every probably 3 to 5 years, as to their relevance and how things are happening. But my question to you was about the one objection that was received to the property. And then my next question, if I may just be liberal, one of the points that was made in here, the core failing of the application is to demonstrate that the outcome is consistent with local policy as well as the purpose of the farm zone. So if you could expand on that with regards to the application, it would be good, please.
Well, the farm zone, I think I've addressed the lot size is almost the key determinant, and the quality of the land being proposed to make up that lot size. So we've taken literally, we've moved the driveway to the edge of an escarpment from what we might call the terraced land form. So the land which might be more appropriately used for either grazing or cropping, whatever might happen to work in that. It's pretty light country. I think it'd be a pretty good crop to get it to grow there. But the gully system has certainly been improved, and I would have thought, and interestingly, the adjoining owners who have objected are immediately on the east side of that gully. I would have thought they'd have been ecstatic at the thought of having a blackberry-infested gully tidied up. But I mean, everyone's got an opinion. My favourite comment is every day an objector, you're only a day closer to being the applicant. But they sit on an allotment which is a former excision. Interesting. But certainly the policy, as far as I read it, is minimise the amount of land in the excision and try and not have the excision create a lot which is going to be to the detriment of any forward planning. So my client would buy all the residual land he can, but he's limited as he heads southward because there's another major drainage line that heads west to east into Cobblers Creek, McLeod's Morass catchment. That he's more than happy to have a management plan and almost re-veg it and bring the planting of the McLeod's Morass right up to the terraces. So, you know, it's I don't think it's contrary to the rural land use study in preserving useful land.
Thank you.
Councillors, any further questions?
I'd like to move the amended recommendation, the second recommendation with an amendment, if I may, please.
I'll move the recommendation, Mayor.
So your
Aaron hasn't spoken yet. The officer.
Sorry, Aaron.
We're too excited having Michael at the table.
Yes, you have to tell us the story. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, in hearing some of those discussions, I don't intend to go everything blow by blow, but I do want to bring a few points to the table. I know all councillors had a chance to read this report. I know that councillors have visited the site. The Bairnsdale Growth Strategy is about a strategy for Bairnsdale's growth, not about the whole region. If we wanted to review some strategies, I can put my hand on my heart and say that I've read the Bairnsdale strategy inside and out numerous times, and in essence, it's a very good piece of work, and it does provide for the direction of the Bairnsdale township. The rural residential land use strategy is being currently worked on and will be coming back to council for briefing in the early new year, as Councillor Pell said, and then we'll go out for community consultation because it will impact so many landholders as part of its development. But councillors, the importance of this particular decision we're making is we've got a Bairnsdale growth strategy that has clearly identified this area as a growth front for Bairnsdale. And the one way, if I can be a little bit crude here, but the one way you can make a growth front very difficult to actually grow and work as a planning area and as a landform area is to introduce a whole range of different landowners and sensitive uses. What this application allows for is for another dwelling, if it was to be approved, another dwelling to be placed on the balance allotment as of right. So no need for a permit for the use of land for a dwelling. So what I'm saying this application would result in is a fragmented parcel of land within a growth front, within a strategy that says don't do it, the council's approved, and it allows for another sensitive use to be just placed on this land without the need for consideration further by council for the use of that dwelling on the second lot. Councillors, I take you to the underlying zoning of the land now. This zoning of the land is farming zone. It has been farming zone for all my time at council, which has been for numerous years, and sounds like it's been farming zone for even most of Mr Sadler's time in consultancy within the area. We've spoken about and we've heard about the land over Racecourse Road that is zoned rural residential. This land is zoned farming and for farming purposes. If we wanted to consider rural residential land use, more than welcome to have discussions with land proponents about considering a planning scheme amendment that would necessarily have it that it would have to change the Bairnsdale growth strategy. It would have to be consistent with the rural land use strategy, and it would have to also demonstrate to not just council but the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning that the many years of supply within East Gippsland, particularly around Bairnsdale, has got in existing rural living zoned areas. So I say, Councillor, this is an application that is totally and wholly inconsistent with the planning scheme, and that's why we've recommended a refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hollows. Any questions for... Question from Councillor Ellis.
I have one simple one just to start off, and then I'll have other questions later. But if this is a two-stage, or it's a two-stage application with two allotments, the existing house block on 6 hectares and then the remaining 100-acre block, you've explained what the applicant do with that second lot. But with the first lot, is he able, or be able to subdivide that in this current application into, say, half a dozen allotments for sale as residential, or rural residential allotments?
Yeah, no, he's got no opportunity to do that at this stage.
Councillor Peltz.
Yeah, if I may, Mr Hollow, I'm looking at, what page is this? Number 70 in our notes, and it's actually got the map of the block, the whole block, the 46 acres or hectares, and it's got the house, the current house that's sitting on it, and the proposed, that's considered block number 1, and if the request was to go ahead, there'd be a second block named block number 2. With regards to the recommendations, you're stating that there's the alternative recommendation, you're stating...
With respect, Mr Mayor, there is a recommendation by officers on the table. If council were of a view that that's not the recommendation they wish to pursue, then an alternate motion can be put forward, but the officers have put forward a recommendation about how they believe the application should be dealt with.
All right, I would just like some clarity about lot number 2, that was all, and I'm sort of a bit confused as to, or not confused, but I just want to make sure that what is stated is the request as it stands. So he is asking for a subdivision between lot 1 and lot 2, basically, and that's what he'll get, or he won't get.
That's correct. The application seeks a 2-lot subdivision, excision of the existing dwelling, and then a vacant parcel of land of 40.6 hectares.
Have a clarification. There seems to be something up towards the Cobblers Creek Road that looks like a construction of some type. Would that be a shed or something to the far west of the property?
It would appear to me to look like a stock dam.
Mayor White, I've indicated I'm happy to move this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves.
And I'm happy to move the alternative motion with an amendment.
Point of order, I think we've got to deal with the first motion first.
Sorry, please, a bit of quiet. We need first to ask for someone to second Councillor Reeves. So, yes, I am asking, is there somebody who wishes to second Councillor Reeves?
I'll do it to get this debate happening. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
So we have a seconder and Councillor Ellis. So would you like to speak?
Thanks.
Councillor Reeves.
Thanks, Mayor White. Well, councillors, I appreciate Mr Saddler's eloquence and always enjoy him being at the table and respect his desire to represent the proponent, and with a bit of sauce, as it turns out. But I take the view, and I wish councillors will too, to remove the emotion and view this purely through a planning lens. Councillors, you're probably thinking of precedent, and precedent in this case is probably an example of poor planning, and we should not go down that rabbit hole of poor planning in future. Bairnsdale is increasingly constrained. As was noted, and councillors should be aware that we have up to 100 years of supply of residential properties of varying types around Bairnsdale. To the north, council approved a planning application, low density planning. Out to the east, through Eastwood, there is plenty of housing supply. Plenty of housing supply for 100 years and into the future. But I'm not sure, councillors, about where our no residential development area is going to be. That's the problem. If we allow this type of development, councillors, we will limit our ability to allow future innovative uses in an area like that could cause conflict with the proposed applicant. We don't know what they are yet. And that's what is important about hastening slowly on this particular development. Yes, the rural land use strategies are coming, and I don't apologise for the council officers for delaying it, because I want them to get it right. It's complex. That's why we have to hasten slowly. More reason to hasten slowly. Yes, we need guidance, and we should slow down and seek that guidance. The future potential of conflict of use is why planning mistakes, for example, the planning mistakes overturned at a recent council-approved application in Lindenow by the Minister. That was an example of a conflict of planning use, and the Minister recognised that. Councillor, we don't want to go down that track either. I urge you to think very carefully about this, and I know that Mr Saddler speaks very well and very convincingly for his proponent. But councillors, think of it purely through a planning lens and think of where is the no residential development in future going to be in Bairnsdale. That's the problem we have, and in doing this I think we limit ourselves, and in 50 or 100 years' time, what legacy do you want to leave?
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In supporting Councillor Reeves's eloquent words, I want to draw on some of the advice that Mr Saddler himself provided to us, and that is the need for quality and innovative planning in relation to the matter. Every application is personal and emotive, and I've seen the correspondence in relation to that. And we need to have boundaries, we need to have guidelines, and this is what the Bairnsdale Growth Strategy was about, was planning fully ahead. If it's not meeting the need, then we need to challenge it, and that will be something I'll be taking back into council. But at the moment, you do have to have that line where you say, okay, that nothing on the other side. And unfortunately for our applicant here today, he's on that boundary. His property, geomorphologically leads to the ideas that he has in his head, but that doesn't come back to dealing with planning and how we do an order and considered piece of planning. We need orderly management of our settlements so they can grow and prosper effectively. Now, Councillor Reeves has referred to that. I want you to think about these issues that have been raised, and as such, I will support Mr Hollow's recommendation.
Do we have any speakers against? Councillor Rottino.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Reluctantly, I do speak against the motion before us, only because of the age of the Bairnsdale Growth Strategy. I've been around Bairnsdale for a long time and have seen where it has grown, and certainly it's an interesting area up here, and I just don't think that we can rely on a 10-year-old strategy anymore.
Any more speakers wish to speak for?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Well, how do we get this alternative motion up? It's as simple, you're going to do that now. Okay, thank you.
We've gone down the path of, after discussion, we have Councillor Reeves can reply, and then we will put it to the vote.
Well, thanks, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Councillor Rotino, for drawing our attention to a 10-year-old strategy, but strategy is long-term, and 10 years is not actually that old. I think for planning, for civil works, for strategic planning, for infrastructure development, for heading our community in the right direction, 10 years isn't a long-term, an out-of-date plan. It's what we have at the moment. And yeah, sure, it's being reviewed, but I hope that the review through the consultation recognises those challenges. And as I said in my earlier remarks, that at the moment we don't have a place for no residential development. And that's what we need to do. Councillors, if you're looking at Bairnsdale being a vibrant, growing place, you can't just live here, you have to work here. You have to have industry, you have to have manufacturing as well. We just don't know what it is in the future. And to create a situation where there could be conflict over those uses in future, I think constrains us. Think carefully, councillors. Planning matters.
Councillor Peltz.
Point of order, Mr Mayor. I did earlier intend to flag an alternative motion, and I'd like that to be heard.
I think I've got a point, Mayor. We need to hear this out before we have any alternatives. That's the point.
You are correct, Councillor Reeves.
Once this is gone, it's lapsed.
Mayor, can we just deal with the matter at hand, please? It's on the table.
Absolutely. No, I've just explained that. We have got to the stage where if there's no more speakers on this, we will put it to the vote. So I would ask those who are voting with the planning officer's recommendation to raise their hands. All those against? So to make this a little quicker, we had the motion is defeated, and the mover and seconder were the only ones to vote for the motion. Now, Councillor Peltz, you may.
I would, Mr Mayor. I'd like to bring forward an alternative motion which was arranged for us earlier, and it states that the application will be approved, basically. But I'd really like to amend it by removing dot point 2, which excludes the lot 2 not be used or developed for the purpose of a dwelling. So I think that's an unfair ask in regards to this. Am I allowed to speak to it? I need a seconder.
All right, do we have a seconder for the amendment to this? Councillor Roberts. You wish to speak to this?
And I'd just like to say, look, we've been asking for a long time. The bottom line for me is I see this as an appropriate development and an appropriate progress for this actual area. I believe that there is opportunity for the southern side of the road to be mirrored with what's on the northern side of the road, which is actually rural living zone, and I think it's appropriate that this area be allowed to develop in that means as well. What the applicant is asking is not a major ask, and I think moving into the future there's so many restraints with regards to the planning policy that this is a sensible move, anticipating that the Bairnsdale land use strategy or the growth strategy, the rural land use strategy will actually identify this as being correct and move forward with this area being able to develop similarly into the future. Thank you, and I commend to the other councillors at the table. Thank you.
Councillor Roberts.
Please, Mr Mayor. I'm wanting to understand the amendment and the the removal of dot point 2, is it the mover's aim to allow the applicant to subdivide further this second stage?
I think that's probably a question that should be answered by Mr Sadler. Is that following?
No, me.
Sorry?
Point of clarification. The intention here was to remove the onus of the dot point A, which said lot 2 must not be used or developed for the purpose of a dwelling. And I think that's an unfair request in this regards, and I think it just is a handbrake clause to the actual need of the application. So it also removes, with regards to the statement of compliance is issued, the owner must enter into an agreement with the responsible authority under a section 173 of the Planning Environmental Act to provide for the following, and that's also been taken out. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Toohey.
Aaron, if I may ask you a question. You said earlier if this was, if this goes through as it is on the screen now, that the applicant would have a right to put a dwelling on the 100 acres without planning approval. Is that correct?
That's correct, Councillor. You wouldn't need a planning permit to use the land for the purposes of a dwelling. So you may need a planning permit under some various overlays, like for instance erosion management overlay, but that's a development control, not a use issue. So at a lot of 40.6 hectares, you don't require a planning permit for the use of the land for a dwelling. So the intent of that condition is obviously, if you wish, which councillors do, wish to allow the excision, it's to keep the balance of the allotment free from a sensitive use and allow the land to be used for the purposes of purely farming, consistent with the zone.
Have we, Aaron, in any case, put a condition on such a subdivision where we would require a planning permit?
No. What we've done before, and we've done it numerous times, is we've allowed a subdivision but have restricted or prohibited the ability for a dwelling to be put on the balanced allotment.
There's a big difference between restricted and prohibited.
Yes, there is. And what we've done is in order to allow the subdivision to proceed, but also allow the farming of the balanced allotment to be the primary use of the land, we have prohibited a dwelling being placed on those balanced allotments. And I think we've probably done, from memory, about 7 to 10 this year, including if you recall, the one in Orbost at the Malakuta Council meeting.
If there are any more questions from any councillors. Councillor Roberts.
I think there's a few that are seeking clarity around the table around the amendment to the alternate motion. Correct me if I'm wrong, officers, but removing the original point 2 from the alternate motion meant that the applicant did not need to engage in a section 173 agreement, meaning that the restriction to not build a dwelling on the excised land would be lifted. No other technical planning loopholes would be acquired by doing this.
No, what you're saying is correct. By removing condition 2, allows someone to put a dwelling on the land without the planning permit for the use of the land for a dwelling.
Okay, firstly, that's the last of the questions, so just anyone who wishes to speak for. Okay, yeah, I'll allow that.
Thank you. I just want to make it clear that the applicant can't just, even though we're saying it's farming zone, I'll make this clear, that he can't now go ahead and subdivide that property for other uses other than straight farming. He can put a residence on the property for a farmer, let's say a farming family to be on it, but he can't use it for any other purpose than farming, and only one house. He couldn't have 6.
Correct. If he wanted to put any more than one dwelling on the land, he would need a planning permit to do so. If a dwelling was put on the land, he could apply, or she could apply, to subdivide the land to excise the dwelling again. Yeah. And if they wanted to do numerous other type of uses, quite often a lot of uses do require a planning permit under the farming zone.
All right, we'll move into anyone who wishes to speak for the alternative motion. Anyone wishing to speak against? Councillor Reeves.
Thanks, Mayor. Councillors, planning on the run is fraught. There's no doubt about it. Trying to get a decision here and trying to understand planning policy, which is probably a 3 or 4 year degree, and maybe doing an honours year as well. So I congratulate the councillors for your rapid uptake of information and knowledge. But honestly, really, ad hoc planning at 1900 hours on a Tuesday night and trying to get the best outcome for the future is really risky, councillors. Honestly, you've just got to stop and slow down and think about where we've got to and why there's a recommendation in front of you. Take the emotion out of it, think about the future, think about what's going to happen in Bairnsdale, think about the potential conflict of uses in future that you might actually have a vested interest in, and that could actually, I think, be detrimental to the community.
I'm not sure whether that last comment was perhaps appropriate, Councillor Reeves, to suggest that councillors here would have had a vested interest. I think that's an inappropriate comment.
In what way, Mayor? Please explain yourself.
Oh, I just felt that you were referring to the group as perhaps someone in this group or others in this group that might have had a vested interest in what is happening here tonight.
Oh, councillors can all make
point of order, Mr. Mayor.
First.
We're off process here. This is not the correct meeting procedure. I had a right of reply.
Absolutely. You have a right of reply, Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the comments, Councillor Reeves, but this planning matter isn't planning on the run. We've actually very thoroughly discussed this, and there's been some really good points, pertinent points that have been put forward on both sides of this discussion. But as a group, we have discussed this very thoroughly.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor. Only the movers got a right of reply.
You are absolutely correct. That was just, I was just
Stand
informed.
corrected.
So, Councillor Roberts with his theatrics.
Thorough discussion
So right now, we need to put this to the vote. So as some of the people...
I do have a reply, and it might be the fact that I concur with my councillor colleague here, Councillor Roberts, with regards to the discussion that we have. We have discussed this at length. We've been on site. We've looked at it. We've banged our heads up against the wall with regards to the growth strategy that we were expecting that never arrived. And you know what? Sometimes you just need to make leadership decisions, and this is what we're about to do at this table. We're about to make a decision about how the growth is going to happen within the Bairnsdale community in that section of the road. And I do concur with my other colleague, Councillor, the Mayor, Councillor White, with regards to your implication of your wording before, Councillor Reeves. It was appalling and ill-choiced. But anyway, I just leave it at that, and we'll take that out later on. So with that said, Mr Mayor, I leave it back to you.
Thank you, Councillor Pelt. So we have reached the stage where we can vote on this issue. So those who are in favour of this amended application, those for, vote now, please. Yes. Those against? Okay, we have the motion is passed. And the three who voted against: Councillor Reeves, Councillor O'Connell, and Councillor Ellis. So that moves us now to our next planning permit application, 296-2018/P, application for a two-lot subdivision at 170 Racecourse Road in Bairnsdale. So we have a speaker before us, Mr. Sadler.
Thank you, councillors. I understand from listening to the previous debate from when I spoke and the ensuing decision that some of these are not easy decisions, but I think in the light, one of the points that our current application has is that we started the journey at 170 Racecourse Road with a Bairnsdale Growth Strategy Plan and a zone called Rural Zone. Today we have, by the stroke of a ministerial pen, our rural zone being converted to a farming zone. Now we know all well and good throughout East Gippsland that just because you're zoned farming doesn't mean you are able to be farmed. That handles a lot of the areas which are on the peri-urban fringe, which I think the planning officers have gone to some lengths to try and describe some of the farming zone as almost a holding pattern for future possible uses, possibly low-density residential, possibly residential. And in the case of 170 Racecourse Road, it started in a smaller lot pattern when the Bairnsdale Racecourse was a lot stronger. And there was a training enterprise undertaken on the property which was saw the growth of a few houses there and training facilities which are out the back. And what we now have is a leftover piece of land. I note from previous meetings some commentary back in April that a number of the councillors made comments that what we are seeing is not farming land, it's houses in a rural environment, and what we're probably proffering in the application this evening is that all farming is lost. There is nothing that can be salvaged in my mind of a farming viability point by preserving this land for future farming. So I think we should all agree that let's not go down the blind alley of we're losing land to farming production and it's a valuable asset in East Gippsland. Yes, it's a valuable asset, and Aaron Hollow spoke before about agreements where we've had no further dwellings on rural properties as part of the negotiation, and good negotiation by council officers to trade. I can note one project where we took the ability to have houses, we actually decommissioned houses on the Lindenow Flats to put them back up on the hilltop. That's good restructure, and in this case the restructure is occurring because the land is lost. It's not a restructure, it's a subdivision, I admit, but what else can we use this land for? And once again, we're waiting with an eager anticipation what the rural land use strategy will say. I anticipate that Forge Creek and Cobblers Creek will and the McLeod's Morass, everything south of there will be farming land, and everything to the north has some opportunity. So we've used, once again, we've creatively used a provision within the planning scheme which says if it's not viable farming land and we use a dwelling excision, that's in fact what we're undertaking now, to almost undertake an infill in an area where it would almost not be noticed. So it is a very unusual application. It's not farming land other than by name. It's not farming land by nature. It's a big front lawn. So we're saying, let's put a house on it. Let some people live there. They might have horses. There might be people who want to live in a rural environment. It's just another lifestyle choice allotment, and it's hardly the start of a massive rural residential enclave. So I don't wish to prolong it anymore. The officers have had a case when they originally wrote the report which council sought not to act on in April. I'm probably interested to know that we have another report for this agenda, which I thought it was deferred. I'm not sure why extra information needs to happen 8 months later, but here it is, we've got another round of reports. I don't know what they've said now compared to the previous report. I haven't boned up by going back and read the April meeting report, but nothing's changed, and we know we're still waiting on a rural land use strategy which will say it's not prime agricultural land, let's get on and find another use for it, and this is a potential use lawfully made within the ambit of the planning scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sadler. Now this time I will ask Mr Hollows to give his report, please. So I didn't forget you this time, Aaron.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor and councillors, I would beg to differ with the fact that this is just going to simply turn a front lawn into a rural living opportunity. In fact, I would suggest that it will do that. I agree with Mr Sadler, that would be the end outcome if this application was approved. I just go back to my previous comments. This is a growth front that needs to be protected from inappropriate development. The continuous fragmentation of that land, the growth of sensitive uses will cause some problems for the growth of Bairnsdale into the future, particularly in the southern direction. Councillors, we've spoken about the fact that there are many landowners within East Gippsland that are sitting on rural living zone land and wishing to develop their land, and these excisions are happening at a rate that is actually taking away a bit of a market base, I would think. But I would also suggest that the way it's set up, this application, is to actually seriously create a rural living opportunity in a farming zoned parcel in East Gippsland. There is no other way to look at it. I take Mr Sadler's rightful comments before, that in the past application he sought to minimise the agricultural land impacted by the excision. So he tried to restrict the amount of agricultural land that was contained within the excise lot. This subdivision, and although Mr Sadler said cleverly interprets the planning scheme, this subdivision is not seeking to excise the dwelling to minimise the impact on rural land. It's deliberately creating the larger lot at 6.227 hectares to encompass the dwelling and be creating a rural living opportunity at 1.147 hectares. So councillors, I can only repeat what I've said before, but this application comes through, and when you put it through the machinations of the planning scheme, once again, it should not be supported in my view. And it is actually been developed in a way to achieve exactly what our planning scheme doesn't want to see in farming zoned areas, and that's a rural living lot. And in particular this area, where we're trying to maintain a growth front for whatever future that may be. Once again, we would get fragmentation, which into the future would mean this could be very difficult to do what people might wish to do, or what the council of the then day wish to decide to do with this growth front. So councillors, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Hollows. Councillors, any questions? Councillor Rotino.
Thanks, Mr Hollow. In relation to the Bairnsdale Growth Strategy or any other planning strategy we have, does it address any of the land or the auxiliary land around the racecourse reserve?
The Bairnsdale Growth Strategy certainly does. It identifies that area as a no development area. It identifies that area as a potential growth front. In terms of the rural land use strategy, and I've got to be careful how I put this, I think people are thinking that the rural land use strategy will somehow start pointing out areas in the Shire that could be rezoned straight away. My true feeling is that won't come from the rural land use strategy. The rural land use strategy might say some very high-level discussions. It'll set some high-level precedents, some high-level policy. It will provide design guidelines and the like, which will be excellent tools for officers and councillors alike to make decisions, and for those putting forward applications, a good understanding of what may be successful or not. If anything, I think you'll find the rural land use strategy might turn around and say, for further strategic work, have a look at your rural living zoned areas. So I hope that answers the question, Councillor.
Anyone else have a question for Mr. Hollows? I guess we'll go to if anyone would like to move this planning application.
Yes, Mayor, I'll move the recommendation.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Ellis.
Yes, I will, Mr Mayor. Thank you.
Beg your pardon?
Yes, thank you.
Councillor
I need
Reeves.
to repeat the same missile that I gave last time.
Could we have the shortened version, please?
For all the reasons that I mentioned in the last discussion, I think this is inappropriate. I think it limits the future of Bairnsdale, the no residential development area. For all the reasons that Mr Hollows has mentioned, I think councillors, we've just got to take that broader, long-term view. Planning on the run is fraught, as I've mentioned. Ad hoc policy at this time of night is dangerous. I think that there's potential down there that is unrealised, and this stymies that potential for whatever business it is in the future. There's plenty of residential space and residential expansion around Bairnsdale, 100 years supply of a variety of product, and I don't think we need it down this part of the world. Don't limit Bairnsdale's future by allowing this to happen. Please vote as for this recommendation with me.
Have anyone wishing to speak?
Like Councillor Reeves, there's not little to add further to what was debated in the previous application. It is important to note that this application, of course, was reliant on the forthcoming of the rural land strategy policy coming back to council in a timely manner. Whether that impacts the final decision of council, I doubt. But the point is, it was something that was considered back in April, as Mr Sadler reminded us, and it is a problem exactly as Councillor Reeves has outlined in terms of proper planning process, and this is what we're talking about here tonight. Thank you.
Do we have anyone who wishes to speak against?
Mr Mayor, I'd like to foreshadow an alternative after this one's addressed, if there's appetite around the table.
Thank you, Councillor Peltz, and it's seconded by Councillor Roberts. Yes, 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 it's just foreshadowed, So if there is no further discussion, we can vote. So I would ask you, for those who wish to vote in favour of the officers' reports. So this application is defeated, and it's defeated 3-6, and Councillor Peltz.
Yes, I'd like to talk to the new amended motion. Again, I'd like to remove point 2 so it's consistent with the previous application, if we can. The bottom line here is I am happy to commend this to the councillor group on the basis that in Melbourne I see land like this being developed all the time, and I look at it and I think we are so restricted literally about development within our region. And they don't seem to have any issue with regards to building and putting satellite developments on top of what would be considered fairly decent farming land. And I put to you Narre Warren, anything to the north, to the west of Melbourne, all of those regions. And I don't think it's fair that we should be absolutely restricted with regards to the guidelines when they can actually just go ahead and keep building all this housing estate and more communities, and we actually have to sit by and stick to the guidelines. I think it's unfair, I think it's unjustified, and I think this is the right thing to do, because this actually is an area where I've stood on that property, and the land is actually, and the previous property, the land itself is no good for any major part of a farming income that would actually sustain that property for a mass business or a business of any type more than just a hobby farm. So to me, it makes sensible, good leadership and good thoughtful decision making on behalf of the community that this is the right development for this particular area. Thank you.
Councillor Reeves.
Well, thanks for the emotive speech there, Councillor Peltz. I'm sure that all those developments at Narre Warren and Cranbourne actually do comply with state planning laws. They're not going ploughing ahead in an ad hoc manner, and I'm sure that many of those have been 10 or 15 years in the development, and maybe even they're using strategies that are at least that old. Imagine that they're planning that far ahead. Well, once again, I think that we need to plan ahead as well, rather than the immediate gain and standing on the block of land and thinking that there's some sort of epiphany of planning that has happened by standing there. I think that we have a great deal of responsibility placed on us for the future. And once again, I say to you, councillors, that this will potentially in future create conflict over uses. Some of you may have an interest in the future around some of those developments down there. I certainly do, because I want to see Bairnsdale in the future be a vibrant, growing business community. At the moment, we are restricted as to where we could go in terms of development, for manufacturing, for farming. We don't know what that farming might be. It could be a hydroponic tomato industry, such as down at Yarragon, and that may be seen as a conflict of use. That's farming. We just don't quite know what it is, but by doing this, I think that the sagacious words of our planning officers should be taken on board, and you should listen to them. Councillors, once again, ad hoc planning, planning on the run. In 20 or 30 years' time, people will be scratching their heads saying, who did this?
Well, that would be, I believe that you would have the right to reply there, or would Councillor Roberts wish to speak? Councillor Peltz, you have the right to reply.
Let's just go with it.
Thank you. So for this, this alternative motion, I'd ask councillors who wish to vote for to raise their hands. Those against? The alternative motion is passed. Councillor Reeves, Councillor White and Councillor Ellis have voted against. Thank you, Mr Hollows, for that. We go to the next planning permit application is 368/2018/P, which is 5 Lake Victoria Road, Eagle Point, a multi-lot subdivision, staged, use of land for a second dwelling and vegetation removal. So, do we have anyone wishing to speak? So just, all right, thank you, Mr Hollows. You may speak on behalf of council.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, you recall that this application went to a planning consultative meeting, and as such, in accordance with the planning application delegation policy, no one is to speak at the council meeting because everyone's had their opportunity during that meeting. Councillors, this is an application which seeks a multi-lot subdivision, use of a second dwelling and vegetation removal, and it relies on access from a common property road. Councillors, you will note that in the report we have been quite upfront and saying that we believe this proposal is inconsistent with the Eagle Point Structure Plan, which was adopted by Council earlier this year. Councillors, in the Eagle Point Structure Plan, the Structure Plan nominated this area to have 4,000 square metre lots. In doing an undertaking of the assessment of this application, we have a number of officers that visit this site, albeit from the periphery of the site. Council officers have taken a deep look around the area And we agree with the many objectors who are saying that this proposal is inconsistent with neighbourhood character. The application is being put forward to create lots down to 2,000 square metres. Now, under the new provisions of the low density residential zone, you can apply for lots down to 2,000 square metres as long as they're connected to sewer. If they're not connected to sewer, they have to be 4,000 square metres. Councillors, we say that this application is unresolved in our view. In our view, it will end up being a poor planning outcome. In our view, it is inconsistent with the neighbourhood character of the area. Vegetation loss is unnecessary that's associated with this proposal, and we believe that the prevailing character will be detrimentally impacted by this proposal. Councillors, we agree with objectors with their concerns regarding this application. We feel that it isn't consistent with the neighbourhood character of the area, and the neighbourhood character of the area, as many would suggest, is somewhat mixed. I would disagree with that. I would say the neighbourhood character of this area is actually quite consistent, particularly within the low density residential zoned areas. There is smaller land holdings in the wider area, but they are within the residential 1 zoned areas. So, councillors, I would suggest that this application should be refused, and we've listed reasons why in our recommendation. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr Hollows. Councillor Roberts, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Hollows, you say in this rezoning they can go down to 2,000 metres if there is access to reticulated sewer. I believe that's the case in this application.
That's correct. You can apply for a subdivision down to 2,000 square metres where you're connected to reticulated sewer.
So, based on the zoning, this is an acceptable use, except a planning application is required. What weighting, if the recommendation was to be carried tonight, what weighting, if the applicant was to go to VCAT, would the Eagle Point structure plan have in that consideration?
If the matter went to VCAT, council officers would obviously support the recommendation of council. Council officers would say that is the intent of what council wants to see developed within this area. I think rightfully, as I've been in VCAT many, many times, those sitting on the opposite side of the table from me would say, well, it hasn't reached statutory weight, which means it hasn't been put into the planning scheme via a planning scheme amendment. I would be turning around and saying to the tribunal member that we are currently undertaking procurement to do that, and that is the intent of this council. But I would be leading with the fact that the application, as put here tonight, is inconsistent with the neighbourhood character. I'd be urging the tribunal member to take a visit of the site, and I'd be urging the tribunal member to see how the other surrounding low density residential areas have been developed with a consistent character of lots over 4,000 square metres.
Councillor Ellis.
Councillor, Mr Hollow, isn't it a fact though that there are plenty of other properties there that are at 2,000 square metres in size in that immediate vicinity?
There are some, but the overwhelming majority in the low density residential area in that particular area is 4,000 square metres or greater.
My second question I have is that did the applicant lodge his application for this process whilst the structural plan community consultation process was taking place?
I think the lodgement of the application occurred after the community consultation period. Now, remembering that we're going to have to go through a planning scheme amendment, which will give another opportunity for community consultation, but it was lodged after the consultation associated with the structure plan. And councillors, I will say that in the spirit of what we do after a planning consultative meeting, I spoke to the permanent applicant and asked would they be prepared to revise their proposal to have the lots at 4,000 square metres, and it was considered that that was inappropriate, an inappropriate outcome on behalf of their clientele.
Was any explanation as to that thinking offered to you so that I can understand why that advice would be provided to you?
The explanation given to me was that they thought 2,000 square metres was consistent with the neighbourhood character. They believed that that there are a number of lots that have been constructed down to 2,000 square metres in the past, and is that such a problem? And they also believed, and I accept, that they believe they put through a well-considered application. I simply voice my view that I don't believe that that is the case. I believe that it is not well considered given the prevailing neighbourhood character of the area. So we couldn't agree.
Councillor Toohey.
Aaron, this proposal, would it be fair to say that the proposal was being put together before the Eagle Point structure plan?
No, this proposal was nowhere near before the Eagle Point structure plan. The Eagle Point structure plan, I believe, has been progressing for the last, can I say, about 6 years. This proposal came through later last year, and the Eagle Point structure plan had gone through significant consultation by that stage. The plan was out. I would suggest that the majority of people of Eagle Point knew about the structure plan, and the structure plan went through numerous rounds of community consultation. And this area was noted down as having a 4,000 square metre character, and that's why it was included in the structure plan and approved by council.
Councillor Peltz.
Yes, Mr. Hollow, in regards to this subdivision, I note to the east of this property, there's actually some lifestyle blocks with a road travelling up towards towards that area. Is there validity that there might possibly be a connection as a go-through road in this subdivision to join up on that eastern side?
No road connection has been proposed by this application, and nor one could be because they've proposed common property to service the land.
Okay.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. I'm just trying to think. There is already a sort of private road area there, and I think the applicant has also made an application for that. What difficulty do you see with that sort of part of his planning application?
Often common property doesn't provide the opportunity for areas to be redeveloped. And what I mean by that is it doesn't allow areas to be redeveloped with roads connecting through to other properties because they are common property. They're not a roadway. And indeed, there are some circumstances where common property has been sought to be given back to the Shire to manage because the common property or the body corporate can't agree on the standard of the road keeping or the standard of design. Not always, but sometimes. But the key difficulty is that with common property, council doesn't have the opportunity, if you had a subdivision that included a road, if you have a subdivision that includes a road, we have the opportunity when there is future development in the area and different things happen as urban areas change, we can't seek to have the road through another application or through a land acquisition process to continue through to join up to another road. So having common property rules us out of the game completely into the future.
We have no further questions. Then would somebody like to move this application, please?
Looks like it's me again, Mayor White. I'll move this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. And we have a seconder in Councillor O'Connell. Yes,
Thanks,
please.
Mayor and councillors. For me, this is pretty clear. We did a lot of work on the Eagle Point structure plan. We moved it, approved it, dwelled on it, invested in it, and we should be guided by it. And clearly this development, if it was only 4,000 square metre blocks, it would be a lay-down misere. And at the moment it's 2,000 square metre blocks, and that's the problem. It just doesn't fit at the moment. That's number one. And secondly, common property is fraught. It really does cause problems. We've seen it, it'll happen again. And I do ask you, Councillor, just to think about the work we've done about orderly, non-ad hoc planning that provides the good outcomes for our community in the long term and the future. And this doesn't do that. It creates almost a little ghetto of development in the larger blocks, 4,000 square metres, of 2,000 square metre blocks. It's just not consistent with what's around it. If it was only 4,000 square metres, it would have my support.
Thank you, Councillor Reeves. Councillor Ellis.
It's perhaps going to sound a little bit hypocritical that I'm going to be speaking against the very point that I made just previously, but I made it a point to drive around these applications the other day and recalling the structure plan, and I have to exceed Councillor Reeves' words in relation to the amount of work and thought and the need for us to support planning processes. But when I looked at the number of 2,000 square blocks that are there, looked at the topography of the area, what was already developed, and recognised that into the future those larger blocks will be subdivided, as has occurred at Eastwood in the future, and we're talking to the future, I find that the application for the 2,000 square blocks not to be unreasonable and not out of texture for the area there. I do accede that the issues can be can occur with the common land issue. I have to accept that, but I just think that this is an application that does have some merit, and therefore I put forward an alternative view to Councillor Reeves.
Thank you, Councillor Ellis. Do we have anyone else who wishes to speak? Well, I think that said, we could move ahead. Beg your pardon? Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. You don't wish to reply? No, we've been down that path on several occasions tonight, so we could put this to the vote. All those in favour of the officer's report, please vote. We have 5. Those against. 4 against. Councillor Toohey, Councillor Buckley, Councillor Ellis and Councillor Peltz.
The officer's recommendation is...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's good. This is the officer's recommendation carried. So we can move to the next item. This next item, 5.3.5, a planning permit application 335/2012/P/C, application to amend permit conditions to increase patron numbers, increase the number of private functions per calendar year and increase operating hours at 717 Wyong Kalulu Road. Thank you, Mr Hollows.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, as you'll be aware, this application went through a planning consultative meeting. This application seeks to increase the number of private functions per calendar year, increase the operating hours and increase patron numbers. Councillors, the reason that this application has been sought, and there's been significant discussion about whether the private functions as proposed currently they've proposed 12 private functions with patron numbers of 150 as something that the applicant believes is ancillary to the main use of the property for a winery. Councillors, we take an alternative view. We think that's excessive. We think that the number of private functions should be 8. We believe patron numbers should be capped at 100. We believe that there should be a condition added that makes sure that when the private functions are occurring, the cellar door is closed. And we believe that there should be a condition added that 2 conditions added. One is about no use of pyrotechnics, and the other one is that there is a private logging about private functions. Councillors, just as a matter of absolute clarity, and we'll try and be as clear as we can on this particular issue, a private function is considered one that would be closed to the public, and it would be one, it would be obviously one that would be something similar to like a wedding event, being a private function. If there was a function about, let's say, a new vintage for the actual winery, the Lightfoot Winery, and it was open to the public, that would not be considered a private function. So I just raise that as a matter of clarity for everyone in the room tonight. Councillors, I'm happy to take questions. I know you've had a look at this in detail sometimes.
Thank you, Mr Hollows. Ladies first, Councillor Ellis. So, Councillor Peltz, put her hand up first.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Hollow, with regards to your last comment, when you said if there was a launch of a limited edition wine or whatever, would the guidelines of the 100 people still stand, and would the guidelines of the recommendation still be appropriate for a usage of that type?
Thanks, Councillor. If it's open to the public, those guidelines do not take place. Those guidelines only take place to a private function which is not open to the public.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Hollow. I'm just a little, having read this file and been familiar with the issue for many years, I'm still a little confused or concerned about this particular application. And I'd be, and I ask you the question, why hasn't the applicant been advised to make an application for a function centre or a restaurant or a, what else can be, a meeting place under the planning provisions, rather than going through this step sort of situation? It seems to confuse the matter to quite a considerable degree.
I guess, Councillor, I answer that a couple of ways. I do understand everyone in the room's concerns about ancillary, because it's not something that has been clearly delineated or measured through tribunal decisions. Some people have suggested that they apply for those uses. The applicants have decided they do not want to apply for those uses, and the answer given is that they don't see that as part of their core business. So that's the answer I can give you, and I hope that helps.
It's only that I just look at the other businesses in the, similar businesses in our district and elsewhere where, from not trying to promote any other winery, but the Nicholson River Winery have recently opened a restaurant there, clearly with the purpose of serving food and providing an additional service to their clientele and visitors. So I'm just a bit intrigued about why something like this hasn't occurred with this particular winery.
Some of the other like businesses in the district have applied for uses such as restaurant, have applied for uses such as function centres. I can only repeat what I've been advised by the applicant, and that is that they don't see those type of uses on their, as part of their offering now or into the foreseeable future, and that's not where they want to see their business work towards. So unfortunately, I can only deal with what has been lodged with council, and that's how we've come through to make this recommendation today.
And that is the conditions are quite stepped and quite tight on the applicants, which has partly led me to the questioning that I've got. One of the questions, of course, that arises is how in the world is council going to police some of these conditions in the practical world? I'm not talking about in theoretic, but in practice.
This is through my experience, councillors, both here and elsewhere. When councils make a decision to put on the conditions of the permit, we have to adhere to them, and we have to make sure they're being adhered to. There are practical ways you can actually enforce these, some of which I probably wouldn't want to go through tonight because it involves some tricks of the trade, but there are ways you can do it. And one of those two is to actually issue a permit which you say, this applicant has come forward to apply for a permit in good faith. We should accept that they're going to act within the purposes of what they've applied for, firstly. And should they move outside of those, or if there's allegations that they are, then we go and do the appropriate investigations in an even-handed and open manner. So, councillors, I guess these conditions as writ can be enforced. We have the ability to enforce them, and the conditions are quite strict, and they're quite strict deliberately because we want to make sure that this use is ancillary and that it doesn't morph into something else, being a use that would require a permit under the primary provisions of the zone.
Councillor Reeves.
Oh, thanks, Mayor. Aaron, my question is regarding, I get the constraints on the application and what's recommended, but my question is about why are 8 private functions a year acceptable and 12 not, for example? How did we land at that?
So this is not really a known science. We landed at 8 because there was a previous tribunal decision that said 25 private functions, and the numbers proposed under that application was a separate use, that being a function centre, and one that couldn't be approved because primary consent under the application hadn't been sought for a function centre. When the first application was approved, they considered 2 private functions to be ancillary. We've had a look at it and we think we must come from a more conservative position. So we say that 8, no more than 1 in any calendar year, month, no more than 100 patrons, making sure the cellar door has to close while the private functions are in place. And we say that that is in the realms of ancillary, and we say that's to our best thinking that we can get it to ancillary with our comfort.
Thank you for that, Aaron. Now, Councillor Toohey has a question.
Thanks, John. Aaron, just in regards to the function centre, what impediments would there be for the proponent to apply for a function centre, just in regards to zonings or whatever other matters there may be?
If you apply for a function centre, you would have to obviously reset any application that comes through. It is permissible under the zone. There would be questions about how long, when's it going to be used, for how many people, car parking, amenity issues, amplified music, traffic provision to and from the premises, possible issues about dust as well. So all those issues would have to be ultimately addressed in an application that came forward that way. Quite often applicants would support their application through a planning consultant clearly stipulating how many days they wish to use the function centre for, what times, for how many patron numbers. They would quite often support an application with a traffic report that deals with car parking as well as traffic movements to and from a site. Quite often they would support an application by acoustics expert that looks at the type of structure that's going to be constructed and how that structure reduces noise from outside of the structure. And indeed, the application would still be subject to the new normal process of being advertised and considered through the normal process. So that's how it would be restructured coming forward if they have applied for a private function centre. Or,
So are these, all of the issues that you just mentioned, have they not been addressed in this application or previous applications?
We feel they have, and that's why we're feeling confident in recommending approval. This report was accompanied by a traffic report. It was accompanied by acoustic report. You'll notice that we've got a condition requiring all activities to be undertaken at the building. You'll notice that we've had our development technical officer, our senior development technical officer, have a review of this application. He doesn't fully agree with the traffic report from one term, one prospect only, and that's he would like to see the access way to be sealed so that vehicles can turn out in a more calm, measured and safe manner. And we feel that this report has been thoroughly gone through by my planning officer. My planning officer has looked at and read every single piece of documentation that's come over his desk and is comfortable that with what is proposed through the conditions that we've sought, that there won't be an amenity impact upon neighbours, an unreasonable amenity impact, and that it will still allow this facility to operate in a functioning manner.
So my question is just purely in regards to, have we suggested, and you've been over this, in regards to the proponent applying for a function centre, but the benefit of them applying for a function centre would be that there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's no limit on numbers and there's no limit on the amount of functions. Is that correct or not?
Not quite, Councillor. If they applied for a function centre, I guess we take out this concern of, is this many private functions ancillary or not? So we may well, in considering an application, still put a cap on patron numbers, require formal car parking to be developed. We may well even reduce the number of functions that could be undertaken from the facility. All that would have to be part of the machinations of considering a well put together application.
So, sorry, Aaron, when you say reduce the amount of functions, reduce from what number?
Technically, under a function centre, you can run numerous functions over one day. And what councils often do, and councillors here would be aware of it and have seen it before, in order to minimise the amenity impacts off-site, we will put down conditions that might say you can only run functions between certain times, you might be only able to run a certain number of functions during a calendar year. We might have controls upon all sorts of manners like amplified music and the like. So in applying for a planning permit, part of the consideration and part of the Victorian system that has third-party rights, which many other states don't have, is the consideration of how do you make a use acceptable within its context, and sometimes that means we put down conditions to restrict that use. So it's not a, so to say, a free-for-all.
That'd be the end of the question session. Do we have a mover for this application? Councillor Roberts has moved it. Do we have a seconder? Councillor O'Connell. Do you wish to speak? Councillor O'Connell, do you wish to speak?
No, other than I think the conditions that the planning department have put on there, I think will hopefully, go towards it. Continuing to be an important business for the region and continue on that economic development, but also take into consideration the concerns that were raised by the PCM.
Have any other speakers? Speakers against? Councillor Ellis.
Seems it's my night tonight. No, I just simply think that I can, council will probably come and see this business come before council into the future for a further tweaking of the application. And I still can't understand why a business such as this just doesn't go ahead and follow what the other sort of business in this region have done, and that is to cater for what the visit to a winery in cases, which is functions, food, to go with their wines, and the ambience of a quality winery, which Lightfoot's certainly is, and very picturesque at that. It doesn't seem to make sense. So by supporting this, we seem to have a fairly stringent set of conditions for them to get through. Will be difficult to police, I would imagine, and it places a pretty tough onus not only on the applicant but perhaps on council. And does it change any of the concerns of the number of objectors that we've had to this particular application? I don't know. So I say to you, councillors, wouldn't it have been better for us to look at an alternative result and not support the application before us? Thank you.
Councillor Tui, you wish to speak against?
Yes, I do. And I must say, I've agonised over this decision for a couple of months, actually. I do feel, as I've said in the past, very heavily the weight that people have put on my shoulders to make decisions on behalf of them. And this is a decision that I've not made lightly. It's a situation that's been going on since prior to becoming a councillor. And I see that it's I've said before, it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. This whole situation that's faced by not only Lightfoot's but by the surrounding neighbours. So, given the issues that I believe, and Councillor Ellis alluded to some of those conditions in regards to the permit, they're far too onerous and put a lot of onus back on council to ensure that that they're being maintained. And I don't think it's right the way it is at the moment. So that's the reason why I can't support it.
Thank you, Councillor Tui. I saw Councillor Reeves adjusting his microphone, so I would expect he will... I was taking bids at an auction.
I'm happy to speak in favour of the motion, and all the peripheral stuff that has been alluded to, I try and discard and look at the planning matter at hand and not think about what could be, why don't they, who lives next door. The matter is the application, and I don't second guess or try and understand why they've made that application. It's about the application. And on the basis of that, I'm very happy to support this. It's a vibrant, growing industry, and we should support that in terms of monitoring and so on. As Councillor mentioned, I think there's many situations where council has that obligation. That's our job, to monitor some of the industries and make sure things are compliant. That's the function of government, whether it's local or state. And that's all part of the business of economic development and to keeping things going. So I'm very happy to support this. I hope you do too, councillors.
Well, if there's no more questions, no more speakers for or against, you have a right to reply, Councillor Roberts. You've moved the motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'll just reiterate a lot of the other comments that have been made around the table. And as Councillor Toohey said, this has not been a decision that's come lightly. I might not necessarily agree with all the conditions that have been put forward on the application. However, it is a way forward, and I trust that the officers will be able to police the permit as it is, and I trust that they'll do the right thing. Lightfoot and the officers, I trust that everyone will do the right thing by their surrounding neighbours to ensure that we can have a cohesive community. And would like to also reiterate that we do need to support successful businesses. This one's been well regarded abroad as well as locally, so I really hope that we can get a good, honest outcome, and I hope that the applicants stand by their word.
Thank you, Councillor Roberts. So we'll move to the vote. I'll just ask all those in favour to raise a hand. All those against. The decision is made. It's approved. 5-4, 4 against. Councillor Toohey, Councillor White, Councillor Buckley and Councillor Ellis against. Thank you. Next item, another planning item, is 5.3.6, a planning permit application 145/2019/P, application for use and development of land for a dwelling and creation of access to a road in Road Zone 1 at 1321 Bullimore Road, Mount Taylor. And we have Mr Hoxley wishing to speak on behalf of the application. Welcome to the chamber.
Mayor, councillors, I appreciate the opportunity to make a presentation or submission to you this evening in response to the recommendation of the officers of the Planning Department for the application of a dwelling at 1312 Bullimore Road, Mount Taylor. I've got to say, on behalf of our client, we're somewhat disappointed that this matter has come before you this evening. We deal with applications triggered by the Bushfire Management Overlay on virtually a weekly basis now. It's one of the probably most significant permit triggers and one of the most significant planning matters that we deal with in East Gippsland. And it's certainly been heightened following Black Saturday fires, subsequent reviews after that time, and changes to the planning scheme have been quite phenomenal within that time. Earlier in the night, comments were made about the rapid change to planning controls within a 10-year period. This is an example of how quickly it moves, and strategies and everything else must attempt to keep up, and unfortunately, they often don't. In this instance, the officer's recommendation appears on our review of the report to be most concerned with the immediate hazard and wider context in terms of egress from the site in the event of a fire. Certainly egress from a site that's subject to a bushfire hazard is important, and it's one of the criteria contained within the planning scheme that must be addressed. An application such as this is referred to the CFA as the expert authority, and it must be referred to them under the provisions of the planning scheme, and they get the opportunity to comment in response to the proposal, both in a contextual consideration, the wider context, the landscape risk, as well as the immediate surrounds. In this instance, the CFA, as that expert authority, has not raised any objection. There are circumstances that the report points out, and a VCAT decision in particular, with respect to a matter in Healesville, and the officers highlight that 4 subsequent VCAT matters have considered that same report. What's critical in the context of those VCAT decisions is 4 out of 5 occasions the CFA objected to the application. They have not done so in this instance. On the one occasion that the CFA, in respect to the Nillumbik case, did not object, they did raise in their response concerns with the high risk of the location. Now, by comparison, in this particular matter before you, they have not made any such comments. None whatsoever in recognising it as a high risk in terms of egress. I think, and we believe, that the statements to that effect within the report are being overstated. I have before me, and I'm happy to circulate copies, an aerial photograph of the surrounds where other planning permits have been issued in the life of the BMO and in the context of current bushfire controls, albeit through some variations since 2011. There are permits that have been granted in those surrounds, and I'm happy if anyone would like to obtain a copy. We'll review that. The context of the location of the subject land relevant to other sites and egress, and the location relevant to Bairnsdale. Now, some of these are, a little bit, they certainly, I'll acknowledge that that a number of these applications predate the current state policy on which this application or the recommendation by the officers is somewhat premised. But equally, I would refer you to the second page that shows applications in both Nowa and Sarsfield that are issued both in 2019, January, in respect to Nowa, and last year in respect to the Sarsfield application, that are also in the life of the current state policy. They were supported at an officer level. I'd go so far as to say, certainly with the 11 Mile Road application, we were approached on that, and in our opinion initially was a permit should not be granted or would be unlikely to be granted. Surprisingly, no such advice came from council officers. So, in the context of other examples where permits have been granted, I put it to this council this evening that this is not a high-risk site, as stated in the report, and urge that the recommendation not be adopted and instead the application be supported. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Hoxley. Mr Hollows, you'd like to speak on council's behalf?
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, we've got an application in front of you that requests a dwelling within a farming zone parcel of land and within the bushfire management overlay. Councillors, I want to push aside all the other the periphery issues here. The major issue in council officers' mind is the risk of bushfire in this location. Councillors, you've been provided with some documentation about applications going back to 2011. The planning scheme and planning policy has significantly moved on from there. Planning policy has moved on to such an event that, and we've given you the VCAT decisions. The VCAT decisions derive from the interpretation of the tribunal about the new policy that was put into the planning scheme. And yes, council itself is finding this concerning at times. We find that when we look at strategic planning growth fronts and the like, it is more difficult to get rezonings on properties unless we can demonstrate well and truly that the bushfire attack level can be withstood. Councillors, the Country Fire Authority correctly did not object to this planning permit application. The Country Fire Authority, through the many discussions that we've had, deal with the technical matters. Can the driveway to the property be made with the proper grades? Can a water tank be placed on the property of a certain size? Can a bell rating be achieved in some circumstances? Yes, all those type of things. And can some defendable space be created? Correct, and it can be under those technical requirements. But what the CFA and I can certainly say that my officers and myself have spoken to CFA officers when they've been available and have asked them to put in writing, did they take into consideration the policy? And the answer has been, we don't take into consideration the policy. That is for council to take in consideration of risk. And what they do say is we look at the technical implications and the technical provisions of bushfire management overlay. I say that the reason why we have to put this application to you is that previously in planning we had to balance all decisions, environmental, erosion, zone issues, bushfire. Policy has changed the world as we see planning now. VCAT and panels are saying the primacy of life is paramount. And in this case, with this much vegetation to the north, we say the risk is too great. And we can't point at decisions made in the past or in previous. Policy has changed this world. Would we take back some decisions? Of course we would. In planning, a lot of decisions that we make, we sometimes would take back. But in this particular case, we feel that the risk is too great. Now, we're not saying that this means the development around the Shire would be stymied in any way, shape or form. There are many properties in the rural area that could develop within the bushfire management overlay that will have areas that they can put dwellings where the risk to human life can be mitigated to a certain degree. So, councillors, after saying that, there's an application in front of you for a recommendation for refusal.
Thank you, Mr. Hollows. Questions, councillors, on this proposal? Well, if there are no questions, we need to get somebody to move the application. Do we have somebody to move it? Councillor Rotino, do we have a seconder? Councillor Reeves. Would anyone wish to speak? Councillor Rotino.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In supporting the recommendation as a motion here tonight, I reflect back on a lot of decades in living in this area, probably too many to talk about here tonight, but as a young bloke growing up in Day Street in Bairnsdale, I can remember some of the worst fires as a young kid from that direction of Bairnsdale, and I hope we never ever see those fires again, but I think there's just, in the context of the BMO, too much risk, and I totally support the recommendation here.
Councillor Buckley, you wish to speak?
Yeah, I'd like to speak. Done that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think there's a risk in nearly everything we do in this life, me in particular sometimes. And say again? Well, yeah, there might be some electric current come up and hit me on the little finger, and who knows? And I think that we don't, the CFA, they know what they're doing. They tell us they're the people that we should take notice of, and if they haven't made any adverse comments in relation to this, that's my view anyway. So I'm opposing the recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Reeves, you wish to speak?
Thanks, Mayor. Noted, Councillor Buckley. There is a risk in everything we do, and the trouble is it's the consequence that's the problem. And in New South Wales at the moment, it's the consequence of perhaps some of those poor planning decisions and developments of 724 houses burnt to the ground and many losses of life. And I think that we've got an opportunity to protect our community and from those particular issues in future, and that's why I support this recommendation.
We have any other speakers? Councillor Peltz.
I'll be voting in support of the recommendation, but it does distress me to you know, to actually have to side with our officers in this case, because I believe that everyone should have the right to be able to build whatever they fancy on their own block of land. And the fact that there's, you know, so much forest and, you know, in our region, I just sort of think it's not the fact that I'm from the timber industry, but the bottom line is I believe that there should be a path forward for these people to be able to utilise their property in the manner they wish. And, you know, it distresses me to be able to have to vote this way because, you know, for me, if it was my block, I'd be saying, well, I want to build it anyway. So, and you know, I don't know whether it's, whether we need to take on the thought of perhaps building underground houses or more bunker-like houses, or like the house that's just on the hill in Rosedale there, that's an energy efficient house that's built into the actual hillside. And I'm curious as to whether that would actually be considered an appropriate building for a site such as this, but I'm told it probably wouldn't be. But to me, you know, even if there was some kind of vegetation offset that they could do, if they could clear some land, you know, it makes blocks like these unusable, and they are left to the devices of you know, being subject to bushfire, and you know, not a lot of return for your money that you've actually spent on the property purchasing it in the first place. So, you know, with that said, I do regrettably find myself having to vote in favour of the recommendation.
Councillor Ellis.
Fortunately, I do support proper planning processes, and the advice in relation to the BMOs in this case must override any emotive thinking, as probably been pointed out by other councillors with this. I am disturbed by the document provided by Mr Hoxley, that when I look at the second page, to see that certain properties have been developed only last year for planning approvals when these BMOs were in place, and that throws the challenge to me as to what's the appropriate decision to make. I have to fall back on the position I've held most of this evening, and that is that we have to follow the proper process. I'm a little betwixt about the advice of the Country Fire Authority, who seem to have, you know, an overwhelming influence on planning and development in different matters, as we all experience as councillors, with different members of the community coming to see us, whether it be at caravan parks, holiday resorts, or else, or simple developments in places like Lake Tyers Beach. The BMOs are there for our protection, but subject to the interpretation perhaps of a fairly authoritative sort of organisation. In this case, I have great sympathy for the applicant, but feel that I should stay with the advice of the Senior Planning Officer in this case. Thank you.
Councillor Toohey.
It would seem that I'm the negative Nancy as well. I must concur with Councillor Buckley. There is a risk to everything that we do. I don't see that there's as much of an issue here as there is in other allowable instances. So again, another decision I have agonised over, but I will be voting against the officer's recommendations. Thank you.
Councillor Rotuno, would you like to, your right of reply?
Just quickly, Mr Mayor. We've seen plenty of examples of disasters where local knowledge has been ignored because what would local knowledge know? You know, we're not the statutory authorities, but in this context, I would urge that councillors support the recommendation of the officers here tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Rotuno. So I put it to you that we, for those in favour, like to vote? Yes. Yes, I did. I said that, yes. Okay, those against? Application has passed. It's gone 5-4. So we have Councillor Toohey, Councillor White, Councillor Roberts and Councillor Buckley voting against. Thank you, Mr Hollows. Not quite. So the next item, as people have patiently waited in the gallery, is the slip road. The Committee of Management responsibility on the old slipway site at Lakes Entrance, and we do have somebody who wishes to speak. So we seem to have had a mass exodus here of a couple of people, so perhaps call a very slight delay. Yes, Bruce. Yeah.
So you're adjourning for a couple of minutes, Mr. Mayor?
Well, we have lost a councillor, and I believe it's important that all the councillors be. We've lost a councillor for. All right then. Okay. Yeah, we'll keep it going then. So, Mr. Hurley, you wish to speak, and Councillor Peltz can play catch up when she gets back.
Thanks for allowing me to speak tonight on behalf of the leader, that's the Lakes Entrance Action and Development Association, and to speak to the slipway recommendation, which we passionately support. We support the recommendation that Council take on Committee of Management responsibility for the old slipway site in Lakes Entrance, pending agreements to the parameters outlined in the recommendation. During the last decade, the community of Lakes Entrance has consistently highlighted the urgent need for improvement to 3 key sites on Crown land in Lakes Entrance in order to help rejuvenate the town. These sites are the Jemmy's Point Lookout, the southwest corner of Bullock Island and the slipway. The need for the development of Palmers Road Council offices has also been highlighted. It is the hope of Leader that with the support of all 3 tiers of government, that these 3 sites will be transformed in time for the 2021 holiday period. The slipway site is arguably the most important of these sites, as it is a large, unsightly site on the foreshore in the centre of Lakes Entrance that has been vacant for 14 years since Gippsland Ports moved their slipway to Bullock Island. The site, in its current form, is resented by many locals and tourists due to its appearance, underutilisation, prime position and lack of public access. The most recent expression of interest process run by DELP for the slipway site has identified a preferred option to develop the site. Leader strongly supports this proposal. The proposal, now referred to as the Slipway Project, plans to redevelop the site into a pop-up culinary and art space that would create a vibrant, thriving foreshore environment where local food, artworks and entertainers could be showcased to tourists and locals alike. These are not multi-million-dollar businesses. They are local businesses that are committed to championing local food and artists. In the words of Councillor Retino, the Slipway site is an icon site for Lakes Entrance. The Slipway project represents an opportunity to bring people together to celebrate and enjoy the provenance of great produce and arts. The project has the potential to turn Lakes Entrance into a place to be over summer and to enhance the natural assets of the town. Leader believes the project can only reach its potential through a partnership with a participating local business, the Lakes Entrance community, East Gippsland Shire Council and other government authorities. East Gippsland Shire's council role and leadership is key for the success of the project. Leader appreciates the encouragement given by the council to the Slipway project, as well as the progress now being made on the Lookout and Bullock Island sites. The next step in the development of this exciting project is the adoption of the recommendation before Council tonight. Like Bullock Island, the slipway does need a committee of management to manage the site to avoid the lack of action and time delays of the past. As stated in the 2012 Foreshore Management Plan, the logical authority to take on this responsibility is the East Gippsland Shire Council. The adoption of the recommendation before you tonight will enable the slipway project to proceed in 2020 and in turn add vibrancy and colour to the upgrade of the esplanade as well as giving a boost to local businesses. Leader urges you to support the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Hurley. So now we could, Mr Richards, you'd like to put forward Council's proposal.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Council, as you're aware of the expression of interest process conducted recently for the short-term lease to activate the slipway site. The preferred proposal received was from a group known as the Slipway Collective for food and drink and exhibition space. Noting that we were originally working towards a December activation, but I guess noting that we've recently found out that this will be postponed, but this does not impact on the process. The key point from this item is that Council was identified as the most suitable long-term manager. So the current manager, Gippsland Ports, manage marine infrastructure, whereas Council can manage for community benefit and for the community. We thoroughly looked at risk. So you'll see in the recommendation there's a number of terms to mitigate this risk. This includes not taking responsibility for seawalls or the concrete slipway below the waterline, for there to be no public risks when taking on committee of management that are deemed unacceptable, that there'll be insurance in place from the lessee, and we've also undertaken some other processes prior to this process, such as conducting contamination testing, which revealed the essentially limited or no contamination. There'll also be limited financial impact. Council already maintain the public toilet on site. Council already mow that area and the location, and will receive the lease fees for this proposal, for this. And essentially, Council can also hand this back if there are any terms deemed unacceptable. So the item is seeking approval to accept responsibility and to allow this positive activation of this site. A recommendation is provided, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was quick. Councillor Reeves.
Thanks, Mr Richards. It's great, and I appreciate the summary and the advocacy. In regard to the conditions and the recommendation, I'm particularly enamoured with point 1F. That's our get out of jail card, if you like. Now, is DELP also agreeable to that? So it's all very well and good us willing to hand it back. Are they willing to accept it back if any of these conditions are unsatisfactory to us?
DELP are aware of, they've been provided with these recommendations and have not provided any negative comment about it. My understanding is that Council can hand it back if these conditions are not met.
Thanks, Mr Richards. Make sure that's on the record for all to remember that that's the case. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure that's been captured in the minutes. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My question's also in relation to 1F. Is there any limitation to 1FI where it states that if there are any unforeseen or unreasonable costs associated with the site? Is there a limitation to what that defines, or is there a potential for an exception to that rule?
I guess the reason for the wording as it is so that there can be a decision made based on what is before officers or what is before Council. So I guess it's depending on the cost-benefit analysis, I guess, that what is the benefit as opposed to what is the actual cost.
Thanks for that explanation. I guess my more specific question was, what would be deemed unreasonable, an unreasonable cost for Council?
It's unreasonable, councillors, is a term that is used legally very often, very frequently. Really, it means it's something that you couldn't have foreseen. So we have, as Wayne has said, have undertaken contamination inspections, so we know that there's no contamination. So there'd be other things that we may not be aware of. We've also undertaken an asbestos review of the building, so we know there's no asbestos in it. So it's really about the structure, the slipway structure, where we might not be able to look underneath the slipway and determine what's there because the slipway's there. So really it's one of those legalistic get out of jail terms, but it's the reasonable man test.
Councillor Retinos has a question.
Thanks, Fiona. The clause that Wayne just spoke about is exactly the same clause we used for Bullock Island, gave us complete comfort to make that decision. I can't see that there's too many differences. One's a bit smaller than the other.
Councillor Peltz.
I'm curious, we're still all, I'm on about the same thing as well, and I was curious to know if we had a signed MOU with Ports and Delp basically in regards to our position, and I wouldn't be comfortable moving forward until that document is received in your hand. I can understand the rush to try and move forward with this, but I believe that is actually the key to this this piece of work. I can understand the community's expectation and desire for us to get involved and be in this space, but the bottom line for us is, you know, we don't want it to be another legacy that we actually receive in regards to something that is a substandard development at the moment that we make improvements to and spend the ratepayers' money when it's actually not our facility. So I just want to be conscious that we are, you know, we are thoughtful about the area, but also who actually owns and who is responsible for the actual facility itself.
Thank you, Councillor Pells. This recommendation allows us to then finalise and put in writing and into a legally binding agreement with the state, with the Crown Land Manager, which is Delp. So we would be then using this resolution, if Council chooses to pass it, as the way we would write to Delp and say we're prepared to undertake to assume Committee of Management under these conditions, and the Committee of Management would then be drawn up using these conditions. So whilst there's been a range of exchanges of emails and discussions, this gives us the firm movement forward, which would then be put into writing through the Committee of Management agreement.
Sorry, we'll wait for the last question then. Councillor Ellis.
Okay, I've been giving this some considerable thought and voiced some of my concerns earlier in relation to risk to council. This is not something that I'm not against the improvement of our foreshore and lakes entrance, but this is looking after the ratepayers for the entire Gippsland, and I must think like that rather than just a lakes entrance person. The group that was being referred to, are they an incorporated body who are going to manage this facility? Wayne?
I'm actually unsure whether they're an incorporated body at the moment, but my understanding is that they're looking at engaging collectively engaging a land manager for the site.
Do we even know who they are?
Yes, they've provided, I guess, the businesses that make up Slipway Collective as part of their planning permit.
I think what I'm picking up from the other councillors is that it's a great concept and we've got a get out of jail card, but it seems we've got a proposition before council that has not had any proper research into the project as yet to get an understanding, even though the briefing sheet's here. What risk is there to council, financially or to the public? What condition is it in? And our thirdly question is, why is it that Gippsland Ports could not provide the same services council to the community of Lakes Entrance?
Answer that one. Gippsland Port says it's very clearly outside of their business model and what they're set up as a port authority to do. They're not set up as a port authority to give public access to Crown land other than for port related activities. So that's why Gippsland Ports have advised that they don't want to continue with the Committee of Management on an ongoing basis. In terms of your question around the legal entity, I think we've got two processes here. We aren't asking you, Councillor, to enter into a lease with this group, this consortium. We're asking you for approval to take over the Committee of Management under the terms and conditions that have been outlined in the recommendation. Once we're in the Committee of Management, then we can enter into a legal agreement with the leasee, and we can stipulate all sorts of things around their incorporation and their legal liabilities and their bonds and their deeds and the payments. So that comes after we are the Committee of Management. We can't enter into those negotiations until we are actually responsible for the land. So this is the first part, which is actually to take on that responsibility for that site as the Crown Land Manager.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm thinking that although I want things to happen for my town, I have a responsibility as a councillor to the entire Shire. And I would have thought that some of these detail would have been in place, because I'd hate for us to get there, pick up something and find that it's an albatross. And but I'm accepting what you say and will be supportive of the application.
Councillor Roberts.
I'm happy to move it if there's no further questions, Mr Mayor.
Actually, just before I've been trying to get a segue. Councillor Ellis, could you please turn off your microphone? Segue into getting our General Manager, Mr Cannizzaro, who wishes to address the group, because I believe he's got something relevant to say regarding this issue.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, from a governance perspective and just a point of clarity, I want to propose to Council that you make move an amendment, clause recommendation 2, as it reads, and this is just seeking clarity, the Council advised the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning that it will bear no responsibility. I would recommend that you propose to move an amendment to replace the word it with Council. It doesn't change the intent of the original recommendation or motion. So I'd ask that someone move an amendment.
I'm happy to move the amended motion.
Thank you, Councillor Roberts. We have a seconder. Councillor Ellis. Just wait on the amendment to be made before we look for somebody to move the new motion. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
So, councillors, with that amendment in place, I'd like to put that to the vote. So all those in favour?
Speakers, Mr Mayor.
You are correct. I've been ill-advised. Please speak.
I don't want to speak anymore.
we've done that. We've moved it. So we did that. Yes. So please, all those in favour? At last, a vote passed unanimously. Now, I would like to ask for somebody to move from the floor and then second it.
Mr. Mayor, sorry. Mr. Mayor, we've just moved an amendment. We've moved to bring the amendment forward. Is that correct, or that became the standing motion?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it was a minor amendment for clarification, so it wasn't needed to be adopted in its own right or moved in its own right, and it was then moved as the substantive motion and adopted.
Thank you for the clarification.
So what? We're not going back anywhere just yet. I was wanting to suggest that we perhaps take a short break, but we need somebody. But we do need somebody to move that from the floor and second it. So Councillor Toohey and Councillor Peltz for a 5-minute adjournment. Thank you. All those in favour? We got enough? 5 minutes.